It began in the dark silence of the South China Sea. At 04:12 a.m., American sonar operators aboard the USS Ronald Reagan heard the alarms. Dozens of contacts, destroyers, frigates, and submarines were closing in fast. Within minutes, Chinese warships had formed a steel ring around the U.S. carrier strike group. This was not a drill. This was Beijing's first move, and it was bold. Radar screens lit up with tracking signals as Chinese Type 055 destroyers locked their targeting systems on U.S. vessels. In the skies above, early warning aircraft circled like vultures, their sensors probing every American position. Deep below the waves, submarines moved silently into launch range. The most powerful navy in the world, the United States 7th Fleet, had just been surrounded. But before we dive deeper into this unfolding crisis, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this video from? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how many corners of the world join us here. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button right now. We post daily breakdowns of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth. And this one might be the most dangerous of all. The Chinese call it active defense. Strategists in the West call it something else. A trap. In the hours before dawn, the People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, executed one of its most daring maneuvers yet. Multiple Type 055 Renhai-class destroyers, bristling with advanced anti-ship missiles, moved to cut off the American carriers. Behind them, Type 052D frigates created layered screens of surface-to-air defenses. But the true hammer of the operation was not on the surface. Overhead, satellites tracked the arcing signatures of DF-21D and DF-26 carrier-killer ballistic missiles, mobile launchers rolling into coastal positions in Fujian and Guangdong. Each warhead capable of striking a moving aircraft carrier hundreds of miles at sea. For decades, the U.S. Navy had been the undisputed master of the Pacific. Its carriers, floating cities of steel, could project air power anywhere, anytime. But Beijing had studied, planned, and built a strategy to change that balance. This morning, that plan came alive. On the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, sailors rushed to stations as alarms echoed across the ship. Pilots sprinted toward their FA-18 Super Hornets, while technicians armed interceptors and readied electronic warfare systems. Yet the reality was stark. The carrier strike group was now sitting inside China's A2AD bubble, anti-access area denial. A young officer, watching his radar screen, whispered what everyone already knew. "Sir, they've got us surrounded." Across the Pacific, news outlets broke the story within minutes. China moves first. Analysts on live broadcasts debated the meaning. Was this a warning? A rehearsal for an invasion of Taiwan? Or the opening move of something far larger? Markets panicked, oil prices surged, regional allies scrambled jets. And for the first time in decades, the United States Navy was forced to admit it had been caught off guard in its own domain. The question wasn't whether China had made its move. The question was, what would America do now? While U.S. carriers were boxed in by the Chinese fleet, another front in the crisis was already opening. At sunrise, Taiwan's radars lit up with swarms of fast-moving contacts. Dozens of aircraft, not just reconnaissance planes, but fully armed J-16 strike fighters and J-20 stealth jets, were crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait, a boundary Beijing had ignored before, but never in such numbers. Taipei's command center reacted instantly. Orders crackled through the chain of command. Scramble fighters, lock down bases, prepare missile defenses. Within minutes, F-16V Vipers screamed into the sky, their afterburners painting streaks of fire over the coast. Pilots reported radar locks almost immediately. The PLA Air Force had come not to test, but to dominate. Air patrols clashed over the strait in tense dogfights. No shots were fired. Yet. But missile systems were armed, and radar operators counted seconds between lock-ons and evasive maneuvers. Each maneuver carried the risk of sparking a full-scale battle. Down on the ground, Taiwan's air defense crews stood ready with Patriot PAC-3 batteries and domestically developed Sky-Bow missiles. Coastal defenses, designed to keep China's navy at bay, hummed with energy. The nation's military knew the truth. If the first missile was fired, Taiwan would be the battlefield. But Beijing's play wasn't only in the skies. Chinese ships began maneuvering dangerously close to Taiwan's commercial shipping lanes. Oil tankers, container ships, and bulk carriers, the lifeblood of Taiwan's economy, were warned to divert course. To many analysts, the message was unmistakable. A blockade had begun in everything but name. For Taiwan, whose survival depends on imports of fuel, food, and critical raw materials, a blockade was no less deadly than an invasion. And this time, the Chinese Navy had the power to enforce it. In Washington, the National Security Council met in emergency session. Satellite imagery confirmed the situation. Taiwan was being boxed in, just as the U.S. carriers were in the South China Sea. Beijing had played two hands at once, leaving American planners with an impossible choice. Defend Taiwan directly, risking a shooting war with China. Hold back and watch an ally strangled into submission. The president's advisors split into factions. The hawks insisted that American credibility was on the line. To stand by and do nothing would shatter the trust of allies like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. The doves warned that direct involvement could ignite World War III before dawn. Japan raised its alert level to the highest in decades. Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyers sailed from Yokosuka, and F-35 fighters took to the skies over Okinawa. Australia issued statements of unwavering support for Taiwan, while South Korea watched nervously, wary of provoking the North. In Taipei itself, the streets were tense but defiant. Civilians lined up at supermarkets to stockpile essentials, while volunteer groups trained in civil defense drills. Social media lit up with hashtags like Wanjdar Defend Taiwan and Yao Stand with Freedom, even as Chinese state media declared the reunification process had already begun. Global markets spiraled downward. Tech investors panicked as they realized that Taiwan, the world's beating heart of semiconductor production, was now at the center of a potential war. A single blockade could cripple supply chains worldwide. And in living rooms across the globe, ordinary people watched live footage of dogfights over the strait, Chinese warships shadowing freighters, and U.S. carriers locked in standoffs with planned destroyers. The sense was inescapable. The world was sliding toward catastrophe. What do you think? Should the United States defend Taiwan at all costs, even if it risks global war? Or is it better to step back and avoid escalation, even if Taiwan is left to fight alone? Tell me your opinion in the comments. I want to hear what you would do. By nightfall, Taiwan remained defiant but surrounded. Its skies swarmed with hostile aircraft, its seas crowded with Chinese warships. The people braced for the worst, knowing that one wrong move, one missile launched, one ship sunk, would mean the opening of a war unlike anything the world had seen in generations. And all the while, the world waited for America's answer. Would the U.S. fleet break out of China's encirclement and move to defend Taiwan? Or would Washington hesitate, leaving Asia to face its darkest hour alone? The waters of the South China Sea churned with power. On one side, the U.S. 7th Fleet, led by the carrier USS Ronald Reagan, sailed at high alert. On the other, the People's Liberation Army Navy, with its destroyers, frigates, and the new Type 003 carrier Fujian, pressed in closer with each passing hour. Both sides had their radars locked, their weapons armed, and their crews braced for orders that might never come, or might come in the next second. The sea was silent, but the silence was lethal. On the bridge of the Ronald Reagan, the admiral studied the tactical screen. Chinese ships had maneuvered into a near-perfect crescent formation, hemming the U.S. carrier group from three directions. It was a classic A2AD tactic, anti-access, area denial, designed to trap American carriers inside China's missile range. "Sir, their fire control radars are active," a young officer reported, his voice tight. The admiral nodded grimly. One wrong move, one accidental missile lock, and the Pacific would explode. Below the surface, U.S. Virginia-class attack submarines stalked the planned fleet, their torpedo tubes armed. Yet Chinese Type 039A submarines prowled just as quietly, creating a deadly cat-and-mouse game in the black depths of the ocean. At any moment, a sonar ping, a misinterpreted maneuver, or a single torpedo launch could set off a chain reaction no one could stop. In the skies, U.S. F/A-18 Super Hornets and Chinese J-20 stealth fighters circled in tense patrols. Pilots stared each other down across cockpit glass, their fingers hovering near triggers. Electronic warfare planes jammed signals, while drones buzzed high above, relaying every detail to command centers thousands of miles away. The tension was unbearable. Each side was daring the other to blink first. For sailors aboard both navies, the standoff was more than strategy. It was survival. American crews slept in their uniforms, boots on, knowing alarms could blare at any second. In mess halls, conversations were hushed, every joke forced, every laugh brittle. On Chinese ships, sailors drilled endlessly, checking missile tubes, practicing damage control, and whispering about what would happen if the order to fire came down. One sailor aboard the Reagan scribbled in his journal, "The silence is worse than battle. At least in a fight, you know what's coming. Here, every second feels like it could be the last." On the third day of the standoff, the first real spark nearly came. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer cut across the bow of the U.S. cruiser USS Chancellorsville, missing it by less than 50 yards. On the decks of both ships, sailors shouted, pointing, preparing for impact. Weapons crews locked on in case the collision turned into a shooting match. But somehow, both ships pulled away at the last moment. The ocean boiled in their wake, but no shot was fired. Not yet. Back on land, news networks carried the footage instantly. Grainy images of the near collision, analysts shouting over one another about how close the world had come to war. Markets crashed again. Oil prices soared, and governments from London to Tokyo issued frantic calls for restraint. But restraint was not the mood on the water. Inside the Reagan's Combat Information Center, officers watched the screens with cold dread. Chinese missile silos on the mainland were fully armed, satellites confirmed. Carrier-killer DF-21D missiles had been moved into launch positions. The Americans knew the truth. If Beijing gave the order, the carrier group could be obliterated in minutes. And yet, retreat was not an option. To withdraw would be to concede the Pacific to China. To advance would mean war. If you were the U.S. commander in the South China Sea, what would you do? Order a preemptive strike to break the encirclement, or hold fire and risk being sunk first? Tell me in the comments below. As the sun set on the South China Sea, the silhouettes of warships loomed on the horizon, their lights dimmed, their weapons aimed. The sailors and pilots of both nations waited, nerves stretched to breaking. Somewhere, in Beijing and Washington, leaders calculated their next move. But out here, on the black waters of the Pacific, one mistake, one radar lock, one missile launch, could ignite the war the world feared most. The standoff continued, but no one knew how long it could last. The South China Sea had become the most dangerous place on Earth. By the seventh day of the standoff, every ship, every plane, and every missile battery was at full combat readiness. One slip, one nervous trigger pull, could decide the fate of nations. At dawn, a Chinese state broadcaster aired footage that stunned the world. Convoys of DF-21D carrier-killer ballistic missiles were rolling into coastal launch sites. Their warheads, designed specifically to sink aircraft carriers, pointed squarely at the U.S. strike group. The message was unmistakable: leave or be destroyed. In Washington, the National Security Council convened again. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs delivered a chilling report. The carriers were now inside the effective kill zone. If Beijing launched, the U.S. Navy would suffer losses unseen since World War II. The president faced the hardest choice of his life: retreat, and concede the Pacific to China, or hold the line and risk annihilation. That same morning, a Chinese J-16 fighter made a reckless pass within meters of a U.S. RC-135 reconnaissance plane. The near collision forced the American aircraft into an emergency dive. For 40 seconds, both sides prepared to fire. Pilots gripped their triggers. Missile locks flashed. Commanders screamed into radios, "Hold fire! Hold fire!" The world would never know how close it came to seeing the first shots of World War III fired that day. As if the conventional standoff wasn't terrifying enough, intelligence satellites captured something darker: Chinese nuclear-capable bombers taking off from inland bases. At the same time, American B-52 Stratofortresses lifted off from Guam, flying figure-8 patrols over the Pacific. Neither side declared intent, but both sent the same message: escalation could cross the nuclear threshold at any moment. The Pentagon raised the U.S. readiness level to DEFCON 3, the highest in decades. Submarines carrying Trident Taiwan nuclear missiles shifted positions, their silence more threatening than any speech. Elsewhere, the crisis triggered chain reactions. In Taiwan, civilians crowded into subway shelters as rumors of an invasion swirled. In Japan, air raid sirens blared after a Chinese drone strayed into its airspace. In Australia, naval bases went on high alert, while politicians debated whether to send warships north. It was no longer a regional crisis, it was a global countdown. By the 9th day, the U.S. carriers and Chinese warships were locked in a deadly stare-down, their missile tubes open, their radars hot. Any shot fired would mean war. Admirals aboard the USS Ronald Reagan received a chilling order: prepare to execute counterstrike protocols if attacked. The crews knew what that meant. They would not survive the first salvo, but they would hit back with everything they had. On the Chinese side, sailors watched the Americans through binoculars, knowing that at any moment their commanders might give the order to fire the missiles already aimed at the carriers. Every second was a coin toss. Every heartbeat carried the weight of history. If you were in command, what would you choose? Withdraw to avoid disaster, or hold the line and risk a global war? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And then came the silence. No shots, no retreat. Just the sound of engines humming and waves breaking against steel hulls. For days, the fleets stared each other down, locked in a frozen conflict. No side wanted to fire first. No side dared to pull back. It was the most dangerous balance imaginable. Peace balanced on the edge of war, the Pacific balanced on the edge of fire. One missile, one mistake, one moment of human error, and the South China Sea would become the spark that lit the world ablaze. The South China Sea had become a powder keg, a vast ocean where the world's two most powerful navies stared at each other with weapons ready. One wrong signal, one radar misread, one order shouted in panic, and the first shots of World War III would tear across the Pacific. The truth was simple and terrifying. The U.S. carriers were surrounded, China was not backing down, and Taiwan hung in the balance. Billions of people around the world watched the live feeds, jets roaring, destroyers prowling, missiles rolling into launch positions, and asked the same question: how much longer can this last before someone pulls the trigger? History was balanced on a knife's edge, and the next move, whether retreat, negotiation, or a strike would decide not just the fate of Asia, but the fate of the world. Final audience question. Do you believe China will launch the first strike? Or is this just a massive show of force to scare the US away? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit subscribe right now. We bring you daily stories of military flashpoints, shocking scenarios, and global conflicts that could change history overnight. Stay safe, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next video.